the 3rd of April, 2026. A major shift in the battlefields of eastern Ukraine has now been confirmed by multiple military intelligence sources and satellite imagery analysts. After months of grinding positional warfare and relentless artillery duels, Ukrainian defense forces have achieved what many Western military strategists had considered, until just 48 hours ago, a deeply unlikely breakthrough. Ukrainian brigades, supported by newly arrived long-range precision systems and a coordinated wave of drone strikes, have reportedly cracked open a section of the Russian defensive line in the Zaporizhzhia sector. The breach, centered near the strategic village of Robotyne but extending along a 15-kilometer front, has forced the Russian military command to order a tactical withdrawal of what Moscow itself has described as some of its most capable units. Among those now falling back are elements of the Russian 76th Guards Air Assault Division, the 7th Guards Mountain Air Assault Division, and the infamous Wagner-affiliated storm detachments that had been reconstituted under Russian Defense Ministry command. These are not conscript units or territorial militias. These are the forces that the Kremlin has long held as its elite, the spearhead of its summer offensive campaigns, the troops that were expected to hold the line against any Ukrainian counter-assault. And according to intercepted communications and open-source intelligence tracked by several independent monitoring groups, parts of these formations are not simply conducting a controlled repositioning. They are retreating eastward, with some columns reportedly pulling back toward the administrative border of the Rostov region, inside Russia itself. The direction of travel, verified by commercial satellite imagery taken in the early hours of this morning, shows military convoys heading away from the front lines and toward the city of Taganrog, a key logistical hub for Russian operations in the south. From there, the road to Moscow is a direct route, and while no official statement from the Kremlin has acknowledged a withdrawal of elite troops toward the capital, Russian military bloggers who have traditionally acted as unofficial spokesmen for the Ministry of Defense have begun using phrases such as regrouping of selected units and rotation for rest and replenishment. The Ukrainian military command, in its daily operational update, has been more direct. The General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine stated that Russian forces in the Zaporizhzhia direction have lost cohesion and are abandoning prepared defensive positions in what it called a hasty and disorderly movement to the rear. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy, in a late-night address delivered from an undisclosed location, said that while the situation remains extremely difficult across the entire front line, the past 72 hours have demonstrated that the Russian military can be broken. He did not declare a victory, but his tone carried a confidence that has been rarely heard since the first months of the full-scale invasion. The breakthrough itself did not happen overnight. Military analysts who have been tracking the evolution of the front line for the past 6 months point to a deliberate and methodical campaign by Ukrainian forces to degrade Russian defensive capabilities before any major ground assault. For weeks, Ukrainian long-range fires, including drone-delivered munitions and precision-guided rockets, had targeted Russian artillery pieces, ammunition depots, electronic warfare systems, and command posts behind the Zaporizhzhia sector. The goal was not simply to destroy equipment, but to create a condition of systemic blindness and supply starvation. Russian forces had built a layered defense of minefields, anti-tank ditches, dragon's teeth, concrete obstacles, and interlocking trenches. But those defenses rely on continuous resupply of mines, fuel, food, and ammunition, as well as real-time intelligence from drones and observation posts. By targeting the logistical nodes and the drone operators, Ukrainian planners believed they could open a corridor. What made the difference in the past several days appears to be a combination of two factors. The first is a sustained and aggressive campaign of early morning drone attacks, launched well before dawn and continuing through the day. These attacks are not the large-scale Shahed-type one-way drones that Russia has used against Ukrainian cities. Instead, they are a mixed swarm of first-person view or FPV drones, larger reconnaissance drones equipped with grenade-dropping mechanisms, and, according to unconfirmed reports, a small number of new long-range loitering munitions that Ukrainian defense contractors have been developing in secret. The second factor is the deployment of a newly arrived batch of armored vehicles, including Western-supplied mine rollers and breaching vehicles which allowed Ukrainian engineers to clear paths through the dense minefields at a speed that Russian defenders had not anticipated. The early drone attacks have become a signature of this Ukrainian offensive, but describing them as simply early undersells their strategic impact. For the past 2 weeks, Ukrainian drone operators have been launching what can only be described as pre-dawn harassment campaigns that begin at approximately 3 in the morning local time and continue without pause until first light. The drones target not only military vehicles but also the human element, the soldiers who need sleep to maintain combat effectiveness. Russian soldiers in the trenches have described, in intercepted radio communications and in social media posts that have since been deleted or restricted, a state of constant exhaustion. One message, attributed to a Russian sergeant from the 58th Combined Arms Army, complained that every time a soldier closed his eyes, a drone would appear, sometimes dropping a small fragmentation grenade, sometimes simply hovering to force the soldiers to remain alert. Over time, this sleep deprivation, combined with the loss of hot meals due to targeted supply convoy strikes, has degraded the physical and mental state of the defending troops. When the Ukrainian ground assault finally came, it was not a massive wave of tanks and infantry fighting vehicles. It was a series of small, highly coordinated actions by multiple platoon-sized groups that exploited gaps created by the drone campaign. These groups bypassed strong points, attacked from directions the Russians had not prepared for, and used their own drone coverage to call artillery fire on any Russian unit attempting to move reserves to the breach. The result was a cascading failure. A single company of Russian elite paratroopers found itself isolated, outflanked, and without radio contact to its brigade headquarters. Within hours, the decision to withdraw was made not by the local commander but by the operational command in Rostov-on-Don, which saw the risk of encirclement as unacceptable. Why does this matter globally? The answer lies not in the capture of a few square kilometers of farmland and tree lines, but in the symbolic and psychological weight of the units involved. Russian elite troops, specifically the Airborne Forces, or VDV, have been presented by Kremlin propaganda as invincible, as the ultimate expression of Russian military power. They were the ones who attempted to seize Hostomel Airport outside Kyiv in the opening days of the full-scale invasion. They were the ones who have been used as fire brigades, rushing from one crisis point to another to shore up collapsing lines. And now, according to multiple independent military analysts, including those at the Institute for the Study of War and the Royal United Services Institute, elements of these elite divisions are no longer just withdrawing, they are retreating in a way that suggests a loss of trust in their own command structure and in the feasibility of holding the current line. The retreat toward Moscow, even if initially only for regrouping, carries enormous political risk for President Vladimir Putin. For more than 2 years, Putin has assured the Russian public that the war is proceeding according to plan, that the army is only getting stronger, and that any setbacks are temporary. The sight of elite paratroopers moving east, away from the front, and toward the capital, is a narrative that even tightly controlled state media will struggle to spin as a positive development. Russian military bloggers, who have often been more honest than official sources, are already asking uncomfortable questions. One prominent blogger with close ties to the Ministry of Defense wrote early this morning that if the VDV cannot hold the line, then no one can. Another noted that the retreat to Russia's own territory is not a regrouping, it is a flight. The Kremlin has not yet commented directly, but state television broadcasts have noticeably shifted away from battlefield updates and towards stories about economic resilience and Western sanctions. The political implications extend far beyond Russia's borders. In Washington, London, Berlin, and Paris, government officials have been monitoring the breakthrough with a mixture of relief and caution. Relief because a Ukrainian success bolsters the argument that continued military aid is not a waste, that the Ukrainian military can still achieve meaningful results. Caution because any major Russian defeat raises the specter of escalation, whether through the use of tactical nuclear weapons, a renewed mobilization inside Russia, or a dramatic intensification of attacks on Ukrainian civilian infrastructure. The Biden administration, in an uncharacteristically quick statement, said that it is aware of the reports and is in close consultation with Ukrainian partners but offered no details about whether the United States had provided real-time intelligence to support the breakthrough. Behind the scenes, diplomatic sources say that Western intelligence agencies have been scrambling to determine the full extent of the Russian retreat and to assess whether it represents a localized failure or the beginning of a broader collapse. European Union Foreign Policy Chief Josep Borrell, speaking to reporters in Brussels, said that any Ukrainian success on the battlefield is a success for European security, but he warned against premature triumphalism. The economic impact is already being felt in global energy and grain markets. Futures prices for natural gas in Europe rose sharply in early trading, not because of supply disruptions, but because traders anticipate that a Ukrainian breakthrough could shorten the war, which would eventually lead to the lifting of sanctions on Russian energy exports and a flood of supply. That may seem counterintuitive, but commodity markets often move on expectations of future peace rather than current conflict. Grain prices, however, have fallen slightly, as Ukrainian forces have pushed Russian artillery out of range of some of the Black Sea shipping lanes, improving the safety corridor for Ukrainian agricultural exports. The Russian ruble, which has been artificially supported by capital controls and forced foreign currency sales, weakened against the dollar and the yuan, reflecting nervousness among Russian elites about the stability of the regime. Social consequences inside both Ukraine and Russia are profound. In Ukraine, news of the breakthrough has been met with widespread relief, but not celebration. The country has lived through 2 years of grinding war, and its people have learned to temper hope with realism. In cities like Kharkiv, Dnipro, and Odessa, residents watch the reports quietly, many of them thinking not of victory, but of the friends and family members who have died or been wounded in the long fight to reach this point. In Russian society, the news is being suppressed but not entirely hidden. Internet monitoring groups report a surge in searches for terms related to VDV retreat and Zaporizhzhia breakthrough on Russian search engines, despite official attempts to block or deprioritize such results. The Kremlin's ability to control the narrative is no longer absolute, and the appearance of elite troops moving toward Moscow, even if they are only passing through on their way to rear bases, feeds a growing undercurrent of anxiety. Social media channels that have survived censorship are filled with dark humor and darker questions. If the best units are retreating, what does that mean for the ordinary conscripts who make up the majority of the army? International reactions have been swift and varied. China's foreign ministry called for restraint from all sides and reiterated its position that the conflict should be resolved through dialogue. India, which has maintained a neutral stance, expressed concern about the escalation of hostilities and urged both sides to return to the negotiating table. The most striking reaction came from Turkey, which has acted as a mediator in previous prisoner exchanges and grain deals. President Erdogan's office released a statement saying that Turkey is ready to host a new round of peace talks, but only if both parties are serious about ending the conflict. The timing of Turkey's offer, coming just as Ukraine claims a major battlefield success, is seen by many analysts as an attempt to lock in Ukrainian gains before Russia can launch a counteroffensive. Expert-level analysis from retired generals and military strategists has focused on one central question. Is this breakthrough the result of a permanent shift in the balance of forces, or is it a temporary success that Russia can reverse with a determined counterattack? The answer, according to a consensus view expressed in a series of briefings from the International Institute for Strategic Studies, depends on 2 variables. The first is whether Ukraine can exploit the breach quickly enough to expand it into a true operational level penetration, moving beyond the first line of Russian defenses and into the rear areas where logistics and command centers are more vulnerable. The second variable is the state of Russian reserves. Russia has been training new units for months, but many of those units are not yet fully equipped or combat ready. If Moscow decides to throw these partially trained battalions into the fight, it could stop the Ukrainian advance, but at a terrible cost in human life. Alternatively, Russia could choose to trade space for time, pulling back to a new defensive line further east, while using its air force and long-range missiles to hammer Ukrainian supply lines. That approach would avoid the risk of a catastrophic collapse, but would cede more territory to Ukraine, a politically difficult decision for Putin. What happens next is not a matter of pure speculation, but there are clear indicators to watch. In the next 72 hours, Ukrainian forces will likely attempt to widen the breach and push reconnaissance units toward the town of Tokmak, a key rail and road hub that sits behind the current Russian line. If Tokmak comes under direct fire, Russian logistics for the entire Zaporizhzhia front will be severely compromised. At the same time, the Kremlin must decide whether to announce a formal withdrawal or to continue describing the movement of elite troops as a planned rotation. Any acknowledgement of a retreat would be a propaganda disaster, but a refusal to acknowledge reality could cause panic among other units who realize they have been left without support. The coming days will determine whether this breakthrough becomes the turning point that many have predicted or just another chapter in a long and bloody war of attrition. End of Part 1. Await command to continue with Part 2. Continue Part 2. As the sun rises over the Eastern European battlefield on this second day of April, 2026, the reality of what has occurred in the Zaporizhzhia sector is only now beginning to be fully understood by military planners in Moscow, Kyiv, and Western capitals. The Ukrainian breakthrough, which began as a localized breach of Russian defensive lines near Robotyne, has in the past 18 hours shown signs of expanding into something far more significant. According to live mapping data from several open-source intelligence accounts that have proven reliable throughout the war, Ukrainian armored reconnaissance units have advanced as far as 10 kilometers beyond the original front line in certain areas. These are not massed columns of tanks and infantry fighting vehicles, but small, highly mobile groups equipped with drones and anti-tank missiles probing for weaknesses, bypassing Russian strongpoints, and reporting back to artillery batteries that are now being moved forward to consolidate the gains. The Russian response has been fragmented. While some units have conducted orderly withdrawals, others have been caught in what appears to be a state of confusion. Intercepted communications, verified by multiple independent sources, indicate that at least 2 Russian battalion tactical groups lost contact with their higher headquarters for several hours overnight. In one case, a Russian company commander was heard on an open channel asking for permission to retreat, only to be told that no one in the brigade command could authorize such a move because the brigade commander himself had left his post. The fog of war is dense, and not every report can be independently confirmed, but the pattern that emerges from satellite imagery, drone footage released by Ukrainian units, and social media posts from both sides is consistent. The Russian defensive line that was supposed to be impregnable has been cracked, and the forces holding it are no longer acting as a coherent army. The early morning drone attacks that preceded the ground offensive have only intensified. Ukrainian drone units are now operating what can only be described as a continuous air harassment campaign, launching waves of FPV drones at Russian rear area logistics hubs, fuel depots, and troop assembly points. The drones are cheap, often assembled in makeshift workshops using commercially available components, but they are effective. Russian military bloggers have begun referring to the hours between 2 and 5 in the morning as the dead hours, because that is when the drones are most active, targeting vehicles that have stopped for the night, soldiers who have taken off their body armor to sleep, and command posts that have become complacent. One blogger, who claims to have served as a drone operator himself, wrote that the Ukrainian approach has changed the fundamental nature of frontline life. He said that in the past, Russian soldiers could expect some periods of quiet, even in active sectors. Now, he wrote, there is no quiet. The drones come in waves, each wave lasting 20 to 30 minutes, and between waves, the soldiers must remain alert because a single drone can return. The psychological toll, he said, is worse than the physical damage. Soldiers are breaking down, refusing orders, and in some cases abandoning their positions without permission. The Russian Ministry of Defense has not confirmed any of these claims, but in its morning briefing, the ministry acknowledged that intense drone activity was observed along the entire Zaporizhzhia front, and that measures were being taken to suppress Ukrainian unmanned aerial vehicles. The briefing did not mention any breakthrough or withdrawal of elite troops. Instead, it focused on Russian air defense successes, claiming that more than 50 Ukrainian drones had been shot down overnight. What the briefing did not say, and what analysts have noted, is that the drones being shot down are often the cheapest and least capable ones, while the more advanced loitering munitions and reconnaissance drones continue to operate with relative impunity. The retreat of Russian elite troops toward Moscow, as reported by multiple sources, deserves closer examination. The units in question, the 76th and 7th Guards Air Assault Divisions, are not retreating in the sense of a disorganized rout. They are withdrawing in military convoys, with vehicles spaced apart to reduce the risk of drone attacks and with some semblance of order. But the direction of travel is unmistakable. They are moving east, away from the front, and the distance they are covering suggests that they are not simply pulling back to the next defensive line. A pullback of a few kilometers to a prepared fallback position would not require traveling hundreds of kilometers toward the Russian border. The fact that these convoys have been observed heading toward Taganrog and, from there, potentially toward Rostov-on-Don and beyond, indicates that the Russian military command has decided to remove these units from the operational area entirely. Why would Moscow make such a decision? Military analysts offer several theories. The first and most straightforward is that the units have taken heavy casualties and are no longer combat effective. If a division has lost a significant percentage of its personnel and equipment, keeping it on the front line only invites its complete destruction. A retreat to rear areas for reconstitution is a standard military practice, but it is also an admission that the unit has been defeated in its current role. The second theory is political. The Kremlin may be concerned that if these elite units are seen to be broken in the field, the morale of the entire Russian army and the Russian home front would collapse. By pulling them back before they are destroyed, the Kremlin can control the narrative, presenting the withdrawal as a strategic decision rather than a forced retreat. The third theory is more alarming. Some analysts suggest that these units are being repositioned to defend Moscow itself, not because the Ukrainian military poses any direct threat to the capital, but because the Kremlin fears internal unrest. If the war continues to go badly, if more defeats are reported, and if the Russian public begins to demand answers, the presence of loyal, battle-hardened troops in and around Moscow could be essential to maintaining order. This theory is speculative, but it is not without precedent. Throughout history, regimes facing military setbacks abroad have often kept their most reliable units close to the seat of power, ready to suppress dissent at home. The economic consequences of the breakthrough are already rippling through global markets. Oil prices, which had been trading in a relatively narrow range for weeks, saw a sharp drop of nearly 4% in early Asian trading. The reason is the same dynamic that affected natural gas prices. A Ukrainian breakthrough that shortens the war is seen as bearish for energy prices because it raises the possibility of Russian oil and gas returning to global markets sooner rather than later. The sanctions regime imposed by Western countries has been effective in reducing Russian energy revenues, but it has also created supply constraints that have kept prices elevated. If the war ends, even if only through a ceasefire, those constraints could ease. The Russian economy, meanwhile, is feeling the pressure. The ruble's decline against the dollar accelerated after the first reports of the breakthrough emerged. Russia's central bank has not intervened directly, but it has raised its key interest rate in an emergency meeting, a sign that policymakers are worried about capital flight and inflation. Russian businesses, particularly those in the defense sector, have been operating at full capacity for months, but a prolonged war of attrition requires a steady supply of recruits as well as equipment. If the battlefield situation deteriorates further, the Kremlin may be forced to order a new wave of mobilization, a step that would be deeply unpopular and that could trigger social unrest. Ukrainian economic officials, by contrast, are cautiously optimistic. The breakthrough has allowed Ukrainian forces to push Russian artillery out of range of several key infrastructure targets, including power substations and railway junctions. That means fewer blackouts, fewer disruptions to industrial production, and a slightly improved outlook for the Ukrainian economy, which has contracted by more than 25% since the full-scale invasion began. But the head of Ukraine's central bank warned in a statement that the situation remains fragile and that any celebration would be premature. The country still faces a massive budget deficit, a destroyed energy grid, and millions of displaced citizens. A single battlefield success, no matter how significant, does not solve those problems. Social consequences inside Russia are becoming harder for the Kremlin to ignore. The retreat of elite troops, even if described as a regrouping, has reached ordinary Russians through a variety of channels. Relatives of soldiers serving in the affected units have taken to social media, demanding answers. In some cases, wives and mothers have posted videos asking why their husbands and sons are being moved away from the front when the country is supposed to be on the offensive. These posts are often deleted within hours, but not before they are seen by thousands of people. The independent Russian media outlet Meduza reported that searches for the phrase, "When will the war end?" spiked by more than 300% in the past 24 hours. The Kremlin's strategy of insulating the population from the realities of the war is showing cracks. The war has always been presented as a distant conflict, something happening to other people in other places. But when elite paratroopers, the heroes of state propaganda, are seen retreating, the distance collapses. People begin to ask questions that the state cannot answer without admitting failure. In Ukraine, the social mood is complex. There is relief, certainly, and pride in the military's achievement. But there is also exhaustion. The Ukrainian government has been careful not to raise expectations too high. President Zelensky's address last night was measured, thanking the troops for their courage but warning that the war is far from over. He did not declare that the tide had turned. He did not say that victory was imminent. Instead, he spoke of the need for continued support from international partners, for more weapons, more ammunition, more air defense systems. The subtext was clear. Ukraine has achieved a breakthrough, but sustaining it will require resources that the country does not yet have. International reactions have continued to evolve throughout the day. The United States Department of Defense announced that it was accelerating the delivery of a previously announced aid package, including additional artillery shells and air defense interceptors. A senior Pentagon official, speaking on condition of anonymity, said that the breakthrough had exceeded expectations and that the United States was in close communication with Ukrainian commanders to determine what additional support might be needed in the coming days. The official also acknowledged that the retreat of Russian elite troops had been noted and that it represented a significant development. In London, the British Ministry of Defense released its daily intelligence update, which stated that Russian forces in southern Ukraine were likely experiencing significant command and control difficulties, and that the withdrawal of airborne units would degrade Russia's ability to conduct offensive operations in the near term. The update was notable for its direct language, avoiding the cautious hedging that has characterized many previous British assessments. In Paris, President Macron spoke by phone with President Zelenskyy, offering congratulations and reaffirming France's commitment to Ukrainian victory. Macron also raised the possibility of sending additional long-range cruise missiles, a step that France has been reluctant to take in the past due to concerns about escalation. The fact that Macron raised the issue publicly, rather than in a closed-door meeting, suggests that the calculus in European capitals is shifting. In Berlin, Chancellor Scholz's office issued a statement calling for continued restraint and emphasizing the need to avoid any actions that could lead to a direct confrontation between NATO and Russia. The German position remains the most cautious among the major Western powers, reflecting Germany's economic dependence on Russian energy in the past and its current unease about the direction of the war. But even Germany has signaled that it will not block other countries from providing more capable weapons to Ukraine. Expert-level analysis continues to focus on the sustainability of the Ukrainian advance. Retired General David Petraeus, who commanded coalition forces in Iraq and Afghanistan, said in an interview that the key variable is whether Ukraine can bring its logistics forward quickly enough to support the lead elements. He noted that the Russian retreat, while significant, does not mean that Russian resistance has collapsed entirely. The Russians have had months to prepare defensive positions throughout the occupied territories, and they will likely fall back to a new line rather than continuing to flee. The question, Petraeus said, is whether Ukraine can keep up the pressure. The Ukrainian military has been fighting for more than 2 years, and its units are tired. Its supply of artillery shells, while improved, is still limited. Its air force is vastly outnumbered and outgunned. A breakthrough is one thing, but exploiting a breakthrough requires reserves, fresh troops, and a steady flow of fuel, ammunition, and food. Ukraine has been husbanding its reserves for months, waiting for an opportunity like this. Now that the opportunity has arrived, the question is whether those reserves are sufficient to turn a tactical success into an operational victory. Other analysts point to the role of Russian air power, The Russian Air Force has been notably absent from the battlefield in recent days, a fact that has puzzled many observers. Some speculate that Russian aircraft are being held back to avoid losses to Ukrainian air defense systems, which have been resupplied with Western missiles. Others suggest that the Russian Air Force is itself suffering from maintenance and morale problems, and that its pilots are increasingly unwilling to fly into areas where they might be shot down. Whatever the reason, the lack of Russian air support has made the Ukrainian advance easier. If the Russian Air Force does re-enter the battle in force, the dynamics could change quickly. What happens next depends on decisions that will be made in the next 24 to 48 hours. Ukrainian commanders must decide whether to continue pushing forward, risking overextension, or to pause and consolidate their gains, allowing the Russians time to regroup. The Russian command, meanwhile, must decide whether to commit its strategic reserves, including units that have been training in Belarus and in Western Russia, to stop the Ukrainian advance. If those reserves are committed and the Ukrainian advance continues, Russia could face a catastrophic defeat. If the reserves are withheld, Ukraine could make significant territorial gains, potentially reaching the Sea of Azov and cutting the land bridge between Russia and Crimea. That outcome would be a strategic disaster for Moscow, severing a key supply line and isolating the Crimean Peninsula. The coming days will be decisive. Military historians may one day look back at this moment as the turning point of the war, the moment when the balance of power shifted irrevocably. Or they may see it as another false dawn, a brief moment of hope followed by renewed stalemate. For now, the only certainty is uncertainty. The soldiers on both sides of the line are living through events that will shape the future of Europe. The world watches, holds its breath, and waits.